Meryl, Kobe Thatcher posted something interesting on X, and it's an image with a chicken on it, and the chicken wears a mask, one of these stupid blue masks that we all know so well. And the text says, instead of killing millions of chickens because of bird flu, couldn't we just lock them down in the coop for 2 weeks to flatten the curve?
Yes.
What do you think? What do you think about this idea?
Well, yes, I've made that suggestion that it's very important to find out how many chickens are actually dying from bird flu and how many are surviving it. And of course, one of the things that happens when you cull all the chickens in a chicken house or a farm where one bird has tested positive is that you don't find out what the survival rate really is and whether there are mutations that are making the chickens more survivable, more resistant to the bird flu. And it's, I don't want to get into this at the very beginning of our interview, but I've been shocked over the last few days at how many chickens have been killed and how little science has been done to actually understand this illness. And last night I posted on my Substack a piece from a brochure that was put out by basically Europe's CDC. It's called the ECDC. And it's about bird flu. It was published in January. And they say, basically we don't have any good tests. We don't understand the virus. It's mutating all the time. It would be great to have all this information. And I'm thinking, where the hell are these people? Why do we hire federal scientists? Why do the Europeans hire scientists? And they don't do the basic research that, any child would know is necessary. If you're so worried about this virus, why wouldn't you want to find out how it spreads? They still don't know how the cattle are getting it, for instance. And there's controversial literature about whether it's being spread by wild waterfowl or not. So, like the top bird flu researcher, he's emeritus now, Webster, claimed 9 years ago that it wasn't being spread by wild birds, and therefore that was the reason to cull, because since it wasn't being spread by wild birds, you could cull all the chickens and get rid of it. We now know that's not true. It is being spread by wild birds. Therefore, culling can't solve the problem because it'll keep coming back through the wild birds.
Oh my God! Well, Meryl, that is pretty devastating. So the chief researcher Webster, who's now retired, said
Yes.
back then,
9 years ago. Yes.
9 years ago, culling makes sense because it's not spread by wild birds. Because if it's spread by wild birds, we cannot do anything about it.
Right.
And now he says, no, wait a minute, no, it might not be wild birds. So then
it is wild birds, but it is wild birds. And so culling doesn't make sense, but we continue to cull because, that's the policy. And people aren't saying, well, wait, the facts have changed. Maybe the policy should follow the facts.
You would think so, right? In a sane world, I think that that would be eminently reasonable. So in the last 24 months, I think in the U.S. there have been about 166 million chickens or so that were culled.
In 3 years, 168. Yes.
Okay.
Million.
In 3 years, 168 million
but
chickens were
before that,
culled.
We had also had an outbreak of bird flu in 2015. It was mainly in 3 states, and they culled millions of chickens then. And in Europe, a few 100 million chickens have been culled also. So we're looking at between 500 million and 1 billion chickens having been culled over the last 5 to 10 years in Europe and the US.
Wow, my God, 500 million to 1 billion chickens. When this culling thing, this culling of millions and millions up to the billions of birds, is that, I don't remember that when I was a child that what ever happened.
I don't think it was done because farmers owned their own chickens. I mean, it didn't make sense for them to do it. The only way it makes financial sense is because the farmers now don't own the chickens. They are basically peons on their own land, right? The these large companies like Cal-Maine provide them the chickens, they provide them the feed, the pesticides, and the rules. And all the farmer is doing is growing up chickens and collecting eggs for these companies. But everything in the process is owned by these large companies. When the large company says cull, the farmer has to cull. Now, when I was a girl, when I was a small child, my great-grandmother had owned a chicken business in New York. So of course, if one bird got sick, she wasn't going to cull the whole flock. That would have destroyed her financially. But because the federal government is paying these large companies to cull, they're making more money from culling than they are from selling the eggs and the chickens. And that's a problem.
Yeah, I'm amazed we can buy any chickens under those circumstances and any eggs. But you said the farmers do not own the chickens.
Yes.
They do not. Why on earth would they not own the chickens?
Well, farmers don't own the pigs either in the United States. So there has been a vertical and horizontal consolidation of farming of poultry and of pigs in the US. And so large companies own the animal. We're talking 90% of the market in the US. Large companies own the animals, and basically they're renting space from the farmers. And the farmers come in. A truck comes, brings them the little chicks. They raise the chicks, brings them the feed, brings them the pesticides, brings them any additives, brings them antibiotics that the Cal-Maine or the other large companies want put into the feed. A lot of these animals they're living very close together, and they're being, they're filled with antibiotics, hormones, pesticides. It's not the farmers that are making these choices, the local farmers. It's the large company that has a contract with them to just raise these animals. This is what.
But why would you sign a contract like that? I mean, if I wanted to be a farmer, I certainly would want to own my chickens and my pigs and be in charge of everything I do, and don't want to be some sort of farm worker that gets everything, transported to you, and all you have to do is, it's like being in a factory.
Yes.
Why would I want that as a farmer?
Exactly. Well, I can't tell you all the reasons, but over time, farmers went into debt. So most farmers are indebted, and sometimes they went into debt to buy the land, or to buy the barn, or to buy the silo, or the tractors, or other things. They couldn't pay those debts, and they wound up in a situation where they were desperate. And we're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of farmers, and they have basically become indentured servants. Now, in the last 5 years in the United States, let me say, according to USDA, between 2017 and 2022, when they last looked at these numbers, 141,000 farmers and ranchers left the industry, went out of business because of these issues. The price of crops that they get is going down. So they're paying more for fertilizer, they're paying more for everything, they're paying more for the chicks or for the lambs, and they're getting less. And there are bottlenecks for slaughter. So there are all these federal regulations, You can't just slaughter an animal on your farm and sell the parts. You're not allowed to. You have to process that. You have to slaughter and process that animal at a federally or state recognized facility, which means you're spending a lot of money for that process, and you often have to ship your animals hundreds of miles to get to a USDA approved facility. So that some of the problem is the federal regulations. Some of the problem is, the way the markets have changed, and some is that we have monopolies. We have these large, big ag monopolies that have managed to, because of their vertical integration, they can control the prices of the inputs as well as the animals, as well as the meat, as well as the feed and and the pesticides. The farmers don't have a chance.
Oh my, this sounds This sounds just awful. And I think what you said about the farmers, that they are like indentured servants, you said, indentured servants.
Yes.
That sounds about right. I mean, they are in a really difficult situation that has been taken advantage of, apparently. And now they are in this horrible situation where they do not even own their chickens, cannot decide what to do with them, do not own their pigs. And what you said at the very end, that the chickens have to be transported to a facility where
Not the
they are
chickens,
being
sorry. The lambs, the cattle, the pigs, the large animals
okay.
have to be transported.
Okay, before they are killed, they have to be
Yes.
transported.
If you want
Maybe
to
about
sell the product. So it's a complicated system. A farmer is allowed to kill an animal on his property and process and package it, but he cannot sell it. He can give those pieces away. He can
well,
give
then
away
what's
steaks. He
but then
can't
what's the
sell it.
good of it if you can't sell it? I mean, come
Exactly.
on.
And
That's
then there
just
are
absurd.
there small facilities called custom slaughterhouses, and the farmer can use them, but he can't. Again, if a custom facility processes his meat, it's all labeled not for resale. So the only way you can sell the meat is if you go through either a state regulated or a federally regulated slaughterhouse processing facility. And one of my friends who has a farm says it runs him $4 a pound more to use a government facility.
Mhm.
Now, there have been ways that people try to get around this. In some states, you can have multiple people owning an animal, owning a cow, so that when you slaughter it, they're already the owners. You're not selling it to them. They already own a part of that cow, and therefore they can walk away with some steaks without going through the federal or state processing facility, or they can drink the milk of that cow, even though you're not allowed to sell raw milk in that state. There are a few workarounds, but they only exist in a few states, and they're not available to most of us.
So it sounds like there's absolutely no free market left in American agriculture. It sounds like
Um,
nightmarish.
Correct. So there's no free market in pigs and in poultry. Now, and they are managed in CAFOs, confined facilities, because that's the cheapest way to raise them. However, with cattle, it's not the same. Virtually all cattle, while you could raise cows in a CAFO, it's not economically feasible. So they graze, and you get a better quality of meat. And so all cows graze, usually until a month or two before they are slaughtered, and then they may go to a feedlot and be given grains to eat to fatten them up. So because these big ag doesn't own all the land that cattle graze on, there are still small ranchers that are able, but where they are being harmed is in the slaughterhouse issue. So now they want to get their cow into a slaughterhouse to have it processed, and the slaughterhouse may favor the big ag companies. And in some situations, you have to book a slot at a slaughterhouse a year and a half in advance to get your.
Year and a half in advance?
There have
That's
not been
crazy.
enough slaughterhouses and processing facilities. And as the federal government increases the requirements of them, and there's one that's sort of in process now, where the EPA is saying that the all the liquids from processing of meats are going into sewers in cities, and so the town is left with this material, and they're saying, no, the slaughterhouse should process its own waste. Now, we of course support that, but it also, what they're talking about is facilities to process the waste that could cost $100,000 or more, and therefore small slaughterhouses are going out of business because they can't ramp up to manage their own waste. There are some slaughterhouses that process 3,000 to 5,000 animals per day.
per day.
per
Oh my
day. And so
God.
even though there are USDA and then USDA inspectors must be on site during the processing, but even if they're on site, they can't inspect 5,000 animals a day.
Mhm.
And so when you compare the meat that comes out of a custom facility or a farm, if a farmer kills the animal himself, to these USDA federally approved slaughterhouses, you find that actually the meat is healthier, in the places where there is no USDA inspector. And right, so we need to change the rules. We have Brooke Rollins, who grew up on a farm in Texas. She's not Vilsack. Vilsack was very pro big ag. And we have Bobby Kennedy in HHS, and hopefully they can change the regulations that come out of their agencies and sometimes out of the EPA to support small farmers and people who want to eat healthy food, and reduce the intensity of these federal regulations, which have served to put farmers out of business.
Yes, well, I certainly hope so. And there's also Lee Zeldin, who is now the head of the EPA, and hopefully he can. I, I I assume it's very difficult to do that because the EPA has a myriads of regulations that are strangling the economy. But I hope he can make a difference and fast, because they don't have that much time. But I wanted to go back to this expression that you used, CAFOs. CAFOs. That's concentrated. What is it? What does it stand for? This acronym?
Animal facility.
It's some sort of concentrated animal facility, whatever all stands for. But when I first saw this word, I was really shocked because it just sounds so inhuman, or just not, and encompassing all
exactly
creatures, not
why.
just humans. It sounds like some sort of animal concentration camp. This CAFO, awful. What are
Yes.
these CAFOs?
Yes, they are animal concentration camps. You're putting the animal in a very small stall, or with chickens, you're putting a lot of them together in a very small area. They probably never get to go outside during their life, and you are basically filling them up with food to make them either fatten them up as quickly as possible, or to get them to bruise as many eggs as possible. And you're not looking for quality. You're feeding them grain if you're feeding cattle or pigs in a CAFO, whereas they were meant to have a much more varied diet. And cattle, of course, not corn. I mean, not corn. They're grass. They're being given corn instead, which is not good for them, and it's not good for us when we eat the meat. So anyway, that's the purpose of the CAFO. And for pigs, most of the pigs, the largest pig company in the United States is Smithfield, which was bought by China about 10 years ago. And
Oh, it was bought by China.
China
China owns our
China
largest.
owns Smithfield,
Oh,
the largest producer of pigs in the US. Now, does China care about the quality of pig meat we are getting in the United
probably they want us to eat really bad quality meat,
States?
probably. I would think.
So, that's a problem. Do we want China producing our food? Um, they own other food companies also, but Smithfield is a prominent one. And so the basically about four companies control almost all the pigs and almost all the cattle and sheep, lamb in the United States. And what people need to do is find local farmers and make deals with them and buy a cow or a lamb or a sheep, or a goat. Buy the animal, know how it's raised, and make sure that, the meat that you're eating has not been raised in a CAFO where everything is lowest bid possible, and the animal has been subjected to one indignity and miserable condition after the other. If you want to eat, I'm a vegetarian, but I do eat dairy products. And if you want to eat the products of animals, I think you owe it to them, at least give them a reasonable life. Let them walk around outside. And so I try to buy as much as I can from milk and dairy products from companies that are, allowing the animals to graze, producing organic products so that the animals are not being pumped up with, endocrine hormones and antibiotics and other chemicals and pesticides.
Yes, yeah, I agree. I couldn't agree more on that. So very many Americans, I mean, the vast majority of Americans do not work on farms anymore. What is it, like 1%, 2% of Americans
Yes,
who
about
still work?
1%.
Something like that, 1%. So 1 in 100, very few people. And
But I should
many
say
Americans,
that many of the farm workers are transitory migrant workers who are not American citizens and come in temporarily to work.
yeah, for harvesting. I mean that, yeah. So, and also many Americans have probably not been to a farm in many, many years. And I wonder, for example, I haven't been to a farm in, I don't even know since when. I've never been to one of these CAFOs. It would be very interesting to see them, actually. But I think Americans have absolutely no idea what a farm looks like. Maybe they have some sort of, well, I don't know. Maybe some people still think of some sort of idyllic image of chickens run. Maybe not anymore. But it has changed so completely, and we are so divorced from the whole thing. I mean, let's just take this killing of millions and millions of chickens. It just happens, and we don't see it. It's totally invisible.
Right.
If we wouldn't read it in the newspaper and wouldn't realize that there are no eggs in the supermarkets and the prices have gone up tremendously, then we would have no idea what is happening.
Yes.
And it's somehow it's the scale of it, the killing, this mass killing. It's just absolutely horrendous. Yes. And I think many people you don't really experience it because you're never near a facility like that. You have no idea what it means. You don't see these chickens fighting for their lives when they are killed, and it's often a very inhumane way of killing them. We can talk about that. All this is kind of invisible.
Yeah. So
right?
From last July till January, on average, 10 million chickens. And this was not only chickens, there were some ducks and some turkeys. And most of the chickens that were killed were egg layers, and about 13% were roasters, which means you eat the meat. But the majority were chickens. Now, 10 million a month. And when you look at the number, so 168 million in the last 3 years in the US. This has slowed way down under Brooke Rollins and Bobby Kennedy. Okay, so there've only been 2 million chickens culled in the last month now instead of 10 million. So it's slowed down. They're still trying to figure out with their agencies what's the best way to handle this situation, and they are looking at alternatives. So they're trying to see whether they can raise the survivors of bird flu and see whether that will produce, a flock that is now resistant to bird flu. They're looking into supplements and medications that might be helpful. They looked at vaccines, but vaccines apparently haven't worked in the past. There's some places in Europe that use vaccines for chickens, but you have to keep vaccinating them over and over, and they still may catch the disease. And the United States was an exporter of chickens, and many of the importing countries will not accept our exports if the chickens have been vaccinated. So Brooke Rollins, the secretary of USDA, has said, no, we're stepping back. We thought we were going to work on vaccinations, but now we're not. We understand that this is not a solution at this point in time. So this is all good.
This sounds very encouraging.
Yes, we need the scientists who've been working on. So what we're stuck with is, we have a USDA and HHS filled with scientists, and they've all been going along with this bad program of culling as if that could get rid of the problem when it can't get rid of the problem. So these are the people that Brooke Rollins and Bobby Kennedy have to work with. They've gone along with this idiotic program, and now they have to change the culture in their agencies so that people there are not just doing what they're told, but are actually looking for real solutions. And I don't know
Yes.
how long that's going to take, and whether they're going to need to bring in new people, or whether the old people, can be retrained to think more critically. I
Yeah.
imagine that that everybody working for the federal government just got used to taking orders, because if you went out of line, you would lose your job. I mean, there's lots of whistleblowers in the past from EPA and FDA, that have talked about how when they said the agency was doing something bad, they would be treated very badly,
Yeah,
or fired.
Meryl, it's interesting. You see the same pattern over and over again in American society and in government, namely that vast systems are created that kind of capture the formerly independent groups of people who do the work, like the farmers or the doctors, right? They are no longer working independently on their own farm, in their own practice. They no longer make their independent decisions. They are fully capable of doing that, and they would probably love to do that and would do a much better job doing it. But they have been captured by the big industries and the entire regulatory framework, so that they essentially become something like receivers of orders, and they have to go along or die, or have risk their farms, just
Right.
risk their business, their licenses, and so they have no choice. So they become captives in this gigantic system, and that's the big problem. And then you have some idiotic policy that is being rammed through, that they can ram through, and nobody. And although they are probably, if people would tell the truth, probably the majority would, maybe even a vast majority would say, well, this doesn't make sense and we shouldn't do it that way. But my voice doesn't count, and I
Right.
cannot do anything against it. I'm just a cog in an enormous wheel that nobody even understands. So it's just like we are no longer in a situation where we can solve, where we have any agency or power to solve a problem.
Yes. So that exactly right. And here I am. I was a person who thought I had no agency, and for years, many years, 30 plus years, I've just been pumping out information, putting it on the internet, and hoping somebody reads it. And suddenly I find myself in a position where, in some cases, I can advise, Bobby Kennedy on these issues, and I'm shocked that I actually have a seat at the table for issues like bird flu, when I never dreamed that would be the case. And I would suggest that other people should just start telling your truth. If you have a good idea, put it out there, and like me, you may find that people will discover you and say, that's a good idea, let's do it.
Yes.
I think
Yeah. Yes. You're so right. Go on. Sorry.
no, it's just I never dreamed I would be in this position, but here I am. So I'm trying to use it. I'm learning about farming and learning about food, and trying to provide the best advice I possibly can.
And there are other people like you. For example, do you know Joel Salatin?
Yes, yes.
He's known as the lunatic farmer. That's his moniker. That's what he calls himself, the lunatic farmer. And in an upside down world, as the world we inhabit right now, in many respects, he is a lunatic, but only in an upside down world. In a normal world, he is an eminently reasonable man. And he has a farm in Virginia where he does what is called now regenerative farming. So his herds roam the land, and he has chickens running free, and he's doing it profitably. Um, and he has written books, and he goes and he interviews people, and he uses his voice, and he's very popular. He's very effective. So there is I think a real thirst for people like you and for him. And he also said, we don't the worst thing we can do is kill all the chickens, because we have no idea how many would survive. And there are, I looked a little bit yesterday, because you said, oh, why don't you research Germany? What's Germany doing with the chickens? And it turns out that people have no idea how many chickens would actually survive. There are some herds where they say, well, 40% of the there are some, not flocks. So there are some examples where the chickens were not culled. And then the result was, well, in one case, 40% of the chickens died, but 60% survived. And in another case, 90% of the chickens died, only 10% survivors. In another case, only like 10% of the chickens died. So there seemed to be a wide range of different outcomes, and nobody really understands why that is. And so we don't even have that data. We need that data. And the chickens that survive, well, hooray, right? That's, you don't want to, I mean, do you kill your kids when one of them do you kill a sick kid, or do you kill all your kids when one kid gets sick, or do you kill your dog when it gets sick? I mean, the whole thing is just so absurd. And we know for sure that the chickens, it's not deadly for all the chickens. And
well, let me add that ducks survive it almost entirely. So they're culling ducks, but that we know that almost all of the ducks will survive. They're very resistant to bird flu. And so 2 farms on the East Coast with several 100,000 ducks got completely culled. And that sort of killed the whole duck supply for restaurants on the East Coast recently, within the last several months. But the bottom line is, you don't catch bird flu from eating food. So no one's ever gotten it from eating an egg or eating chicken meat from an infected chicken, or drinking the milk of an infected cow, or eating the cheese or the yogurt. So how do you justify getting rid of all the food that's produced by infected animals when no one's ever gotten sick from it? We know that some of it is getting into the food supply because the animals become infected before you can detect it. So it's well known. Now, FDA and CDC are saying, well, the milk is being pasteurized. So the milk is okay because it's being pasteurized. But we don't know about the raw milk. Well, no one's gotten sick from drinking raw milk either. And we know that some of the raw milk has come from cows that were infected. Basically, we need data, like you said. We need to know how feed the infected raw milk to animals, to mice, to rats, to hamsters. Let's see what happens to them. And then, maybe you can feed it to humans. But
so so that's a really important point. The food seems to be completely safe, and we should test it, but it seems to be, because it's totally reasonable what you're saying. There are a lot of chickens who don't have any symptoms, who might be sick, or who, and we sell their eggs, we eat their meat, and it's fine. Very few people have been fallen sick with bird flu, but that
none
also
of them
means
from
that
eating. So all of them.
But none of them from eating. Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. None of them from eating. And we'll go into how it got to humans in a moment, but none of them from eating animal products. But that also raises a question, at least for me. I mean, all these chickens that are being killed, that are being culled, could they not be used anyway? I mean, can't
Right.
they sell them and eat them? It seems such a,
Well,
it's terrible to kill all
maybe they
these chickens. So
could.
can't you
That's
eat
the
them?
thing. It has to be looked at, but it hasn't been looked at. Now, again, what CDC has said is, well, cats have gotten sick. They have reports of cats getting sick from drinking milk that's contaminated with bird flu. Maybe cats are susceptible. Different animals are susceptible to different infections. Maybe cats should not be given raw milk from infected cows, but maybe people can drink it. But we don't know that for sure. We have a lot of anecdotes. A lot of people have drunk the milk and have been fine. FDA and CDC were desperately trying to blame raw milk on a case in California, a child who got sick and went into the hospital. It turned out she did not have bird flu. She didn't have any kind of flu. The local lab had made a mistake. It couldn't be confirmed at the level of the state or the CDC, but still the media for about a week or so, ran stories about this girl who got bird flu from raw milk until it, and then people never read the end of the story, which is that it all turned out to be nothing. She never had it. But that's what they hear about, and it scares them. And, we
Yes.
have to demand that the media do a better job of balancing, the facts. And when they make a mistake, tell us. Back in COVID in 2020, on May 22nd of 2020, an article was published in the Lancet about how people who received hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine for COVID had a 30 or 35% higher death rate than people who didn't. And they claimed there were 90,000 people studied in hospitals on 6 different continents. Who knew there were even 6 continents? And the whole thing was fabricated. So the paper was fabricated. I was driving home from work and I heard it on the radio. It was the biggest story on May 22nd. And it led to all these clinical trials of hydroxychloroquine being shut down because supposedly it was killing more people. Well, it was fabricated. 2 weeks later, the Lancet had to retract that article and admit it. But everybody in the world had heard that hydroxychloroquine kills. And almost nobody ever heard that the paper was retracted. The people who wrote it didn't go to jail. They didn't pay a fine. They were embarrassed. Several of them had to leave their jobs, but the Harvard professor kept his job. And and people kept referring to that paper even after it had been retracted.
Yes, right. And that's one of the most egregious scandals, this hydroxychloroquine trial that they allegedly did with, what did you say, 90,000 people over 6 continents?
Yes.
Mesa didn't do it in outer space as well. Maybe they did. That's where the 6th continent was. But, they must have known all of this. They must have known, okay, we are going to put it into the Lancet, you said it was, right? We're going to put it, it's going to be published because we can publish it there. It's all good. They are all our people. We do all this, and it's going to have a tremendous impact. Everybody's going to be scared to death of hydroxychloroquine, and it's going to get a terrible reputation, hopefully forever. That's what they must have thought. They must have known that eventually it would probably pretty quickly come out that a trial like that would not have been possible in that short amount of time, and that they didn't have this data. It was all made up. It really was an enormous scandal, but they said, okay, fine. But, we have the media. Most of them are working for us, and we have enough people in positions of power that we can do this. We can control this to such an extent that even when this article is going to be retracted, and it will be retracted, it's not going to wipe out the effect of this scare. And they were absolutely right. And that's pretty scary, because if they have that much power, that even a huge fraud like that doesn't leave some imprint, but it doesn't leave a bigger imprint than the original story, then you can do whatever. Then you can just come up and cook up your stories as you like. And that is, so you always, people, and I think people have learned that from the pandemic, right? They are much more skeptical. They have lost trust across the board in all sorts of agencies and doctors and hospitals and whatnot. And they are much more careful. But on the other hand, you have to, for a society to function, there has to be some sort of basic trust. There has to be, especially with a complex society like ours, where we do not understand most of the things that we are dealing with or using ourselves. And that's a huge problem. All right, but let's get back to the bird flu and how. First of all, I want to ask you, bird flu, well, it affected birds, but it didn't affect humans. What happened that now human beings get sick with bird flu?
So it was not until 1997 that the world discovered bird flu could infect humans as well as birds. It had been known about for many decades before that, but it was thought that it was something that affected birds, and there were lots of variations, and they were named based on there are two sort of spiky proteins that point out of an influenza virus, a virion, and one is called hemagglutinates, and the other is neuraminidase. And when you make a vaccine for humans, so influenza is also a human disease, and actually humans and birds both are susceptible to influenza A viruses with hemagglutinins and neuraminidase. So the vaccines for both human influenza and bird influenza are designed to create antibodies against these two proteins that are on the outside of the virus, poking out. And so it was a shock in 1997 when humans got sick too. And this was in Hong Kong, and 6 people died. 18 were identified as being sick, and 6 died. And it was not known at that point whether it spread between humans, but there was a great concern that this could spread between humans, just like human influenza does. And then within the very next few years, there were outbreaks in different parts of China, in Hong Kong again, in Vietnam, in Cambodia, and Indonesia. And about 50% of the people who were identified as having the disease died. So it was considered as deadly as Ebola. Very, very deadly. But of course, Ebola spreads person to person. This did not. The only people who got it were those who were selling chickens or growing chickens or had some other direct, immediate, close contact with poultry of some kind. The biological warfare people and the biodefense industry jumped on this back around 2003, and they said, wow, now we have a target, and we've got something we can make drugs and vaccines against bird flu, and we can make lots of money. And because none of the nations of the world know how deadly this will be, how many people will be affected, they don't know much about it. It comes and goes. We can just make products and get them to buy them, using the scare of 50% mortality and potential human-to-human spread. So the biodefense industry got going, and the people who make money or fame off of that, revved up, and Jeremy Farrar was one of them. He's the chief scientist at the WHO now. He was the head of the Wellcome Trust, and before that, he was a doctor in Vietnam. It's unclear exactly what he was. It's unclear to me exactly what he was doing, but he turned out in 2003, he was one of the co-authors of, co-discoverers of bird flu in Vietnam. And for the last 22 years, he's been drumming up fear about bird flu. And he also co-founded an organization called CEPI with Bill Gates in 2017. And this organization is completely founded on the idea that we're going to need rapid development of vaccines and drugs for future pandemics. And we have to basically destroy our regulatory systems in order to create and allow drugs and vaccines to be used with almost no testing. So that's the premise on which this organization is based. And they've collected many billions of dollars to develop vaccines and drugs, and they want to get them, either licensed or EUA'd within about a month or two. They from the time that a disease is discovered until they start rolling out drugs and vaccines to populations, they want to do that within 100 days.
Yes, within 100 days.
And it can only be done if you don't know anything about the drug or vaccine you've just developed, because you don't have time to test it in animals and then test it in humans and see what the effects are. You just have to roll it out. You've got to manufacture it also. So anyway, their goal is to create more COVID-like situations where garbage products are going to be injected into us, where we're going to be mandated to get those products, and where there's going to be virtually no regulation. That's what they're aiming for.
Right.
And bird flu has been the model for this for the last 22 years.
Yep. Yeah.
And so they came up with another idea. Okay, how do we do this? How do we get a vaccine out in 100 days when it normally takes 15 years to make a vaccine? they created an idea called the Mockup-Vaccine, where we will invent a vaccine for bird flu, many kinds of bird flu, many vaccines, and we will license it. We will do all the paperwork. We will test it in animals. We'll test it in a few humans. We know that this is not the vaccine we're going to use when a pandemic finally arrives, because we don't know what that one will be, and it'll have mutated by then. But we're going to get these vaccines licensed. We're going to give them a license, and these will be basically fake licenses because everybody knows this is not the product that's going to be used. So nobody really cares about whether or not to give it a license. Just go slap a license on it. Once they have the license, the platform that was used to make that vaccine, the platform means the cells it was grown in, the adjuvants that were used, the methodology, the recipe for making that vaccine. They plan to use the same recipe except for the antigen. They'll take the antigen out, change up the neuraminidase, the hemagglutinin, but everything else will be identical to this licensed vaccine, which was the mock-up vaccine, and then they'll slap a license on the new vaccine without testing.
And they're allowed to slap on a new license on an untested product because they already had this other license for the mock-up vaccine before.
It sounds crazy, doesn't it? But guess what?
Yeah, it does sound crazy.
That's what they do for influenza. And so every year when you get a flu shot, the flu shot has been made very quickly, usually in about 6 or 8 months. And they grandfather it in based on the fact that earlier flu shots have been licensed using that same platform and just swapping out the antigen. So these, politician regulators decided, well, if they could do that for ordinary human influenza, it's, bird flu, it's an influenza, they could do the same thing for that. And so that is in fact what they've done. And in the United States, there are 3 different already licensed bird flu vaccines for exactly this purpose. And in Europe, there are about 4 already licensed bird flu vaccines, so to be used as mock-ups so that they can roll out vaccines very quickly in the future and fool the public again and say, well, it's got a license, it's been fully tested. And I'll tell you, it's already been done in Finland. Last year, Finland used this mock-up process, bought 20,000 doses of a bird flu vaccine, and lied to the public and gave it to farmers, veterinarians, farm workers, fur workers, even though they didn't have any bird flu in the country, claiming that they were protecting them from bird flu, but what they were really doing was using them as a clinical trial so that this vaccine could be rolled out in the rest of the world.
So I hope that people will not be fooled again so easily as last time. I would be amazed if that were the case. But I want to back up. You said in 1997, for the first time, humans in Hong Kong fell ill with bird flu. And before that, it had not been a disease that human beings would get, correct?
Yes, as far as we knew. But you see, when someone has a mild disease, you don't look to see what it is. If you have a cold, we don't spend $1,000 trying to identify exactly which virus gave you the cold. And so it's possible that many more people actually had bird flu, but they had mild disease and nobody really looked into it. And the reason I say that is in the last couple of years, so 3 years ago, there was one person who was working culling chickens, actually. He was a prisoner, and he was tested because he was culling chickens, and they found antibodies or something in his blood. And they asked him what his symptoms were, and he said, I was tired for 4 days. That was the only person in the United States ever that we thought had bird flu. And then in the last 2 years, when they started really looking hard and going farm to farm, and as they were culling all these chickens, a lot of people were involved with that process. The U.S. and they also started testing people who were in the hospital for regular influenza, they said, well, start testing them for bird flu. Maybe they have bird flu. So altogether, they found 70 Americans who supposedly had bird flu in the last couple of years. And of them, 69 had mild cases. 6 of them were in the hospital but survived and went home. The rest, except for one, died. One had a backyard flock, caught apparently bird flu, but had many other underlying more comorbidities, other medical conditions. And that person in Louisiana died, and they still have not said whether it was due to bird flu or due to a combination of conditions. The rest of the people, which is 63, all had mild disease. They didn't go into the hospital. Most of them had pink eye. Some of them had a respiratory infection, like a cold. They only were detected because CDC and USDA was going around testing these farm workers. And so they were diagnosed, but they didn't require any treatment. And they had mild disease. They all had H5N1, except actually recently, some of them turned out to have H7N9, or I shouldn't say that. That the chickens had H7N9 recently, and so a different bird flu, but similar, symptoms. And the one person who died had a newer strain of H5N1 bird flu, and so I thought, and others thought, oh my goodness, that must be a dangerous strain. Then it turned out 14 of the Americans who had mild disease also had that same strain. So, so basically, the more you look, the more you'll find. If you start, testing, you test millions of chickens or millions of anything. Some of the tests are going to be positive, and some of them are going to be false positives. Some will be true positives, and a lot of these animals or people will have very mild conditions or be asymptomatic. Just so happens, I think because of the industry getting excited about bird flu 20 years ago, bird flu is the thing that our, regulators and politicians have settled on. Being people like Jeremy Farrar have been beating the drum over this. We got to worry about bird flu. Bird flu could kill us. The what's her name? Lori Garrett at the Council on Foreign Relations did a speaking tour around the country saying bird flu can kill 50%, and it tends to kill young people. She went to colleges and she's saying, you 20-year-olds, you're at highest risk of being killed by bird flu. This is something we really have to worry about. So the government has spent, tens of billions of dollars on this with no return. I mean, what's the return? We killed chickens and we still have it. And now we have it in cows. And we've got a whole bunch of vaccines that aren't relevant to the current strains. And the 3 that got licensed, I didn't mention this, are all probably dangerous. So they all did poorly in the small clinical trials where they were tested, but they were given the license anyway because the regulators were told, look, this could kill 50% of the population. Do you want to be the person responsible for not giving us a license so that we can vaccinate the country, and save the population?
Right. So, this is all fascinating what you say, Meryl. You started saying that, there might have been people who had the bird flu before the 1990s, and we just didn't know because we didn't look. And it was mild, so, who cares? I just have a cold, whatever, some sort of virus, and nobody really knows what virus they have. I mean, that's totally normal. So there might have been mild cases, but then in the 1990s in Hong Kong, there were several people who had the flu and the bird flu and then died from it. And you said the death rate then was
It was
50%.
6 out of 18, 1/3, 33%.
1/3. Okay, 33%. So why was the death rate? How did that happen that the death rate was so high?
We don't know.
Okay, we don't know.
Obviously, a new strain of virus.
Okay, so for whatever reasons, we don't even know why, but for some reason, the death rate was very high, and that then prompted the biodefense
industry,
the whole biodefense industry, to jump on that and say, oh wow, this is great, this is like the winner. we are going to concentrate on bird flu from now on, which they did because, as you said, Farrar in the last 20 years or so, constant talk about bird flu, drumming it into people's heads that this is the new killer. But it turns out, and I guess many people still are very afraid of bird flu because of what they heard, that the death rate is so high and that it will kill especially young people. And well, obviously that drives fear, but it doesn't seem to be based in science. We now know from what you just told me that most people have very mild symptoms like conjunctivitis. It's just or feel a little bit tired. They do not die from it. And even the cases where the media wrote, oh, they died from bird flu, it wasn't clear. There were comorbidities. It's really unclear what they died from. Plus, we know from COVID, all sorts of people allegedly died from COVID that didn't die from COVID. But the biodefense industry jumped on it. I want to drill into this. Why? I mean, what was their thinking? Did they regard this as some sort of a bioweapon? Did they involve gain of function in
Yes,
it to
so
develop it further?
course,
Tell me about this.
So of course, our government, the Japanese government, and probably others, but I don't know about that, paid scientists to do experiments that would teach these viruses to jump between animals, potentially between humans, and to make them more virulent. So, and that was a huge controversy. So, two scientists, one in the United States, but he was a Japanese American, Yoshihiro Kawaoka at the University of Wisconsin, and Ron Fouchier at Erasmus University in the Netherlands, both made bird flu transmissible. And they wanted to publish papers on what they did. And there was an outcry amongst scientists that this should not be published because you're publishing the recipe for a potential global pandemic that could kill a lot of people.
So they made it transmissible among mammal to mammals,
yeah,
from birds to mammal ferrets.
Yes, so that ferrets is the model for influenza viruses that is thought to be very much like humans. So Fouchier used ferrets. This happened about 10 years ago. They were doing the experiments starting around 2010, and they wanted to publish around 2012, and they were told to halt the publication. Hundreds of scientists petitioned NIH saying this should not be done and there should be a moratorium on gain-of-function research. This type of gain-of-function research it doesn't provide any good defense against it. You're just creating the weapon. And as a result, in 2014, under Obama, a moratorium was placed on gain-of-function research, but not all gain-of-function research. Only, this is very interesting, only for two kinds of viruses, two classes of viruses. One was for SARS-like viruses, like COVID, and the other one was for avian influenza viruses. So you could still do gain of function on any other viruses or bacteria you wanted, but there was a moratorium on those too. And supposedly you had to ask, if you were being funded by the government, you had to ask a committee that was formed at NIH for permission to do those studies. It turned out this was all bullshit. The committee rarely met. They reviewed less than 6 studies. And Ralph Barrick at the University of North Carolina, who was doing gain of function on SARS-like viruses, thought he was given a waiver. In one of his published papers that I've read, I've seen it with my own eyes, he said he got a waiver to do these studies. But what we know when Fauci's emails were released is that Fauci's assistant, Dr. Auchincloss, said, look, we've never given Barrick a waiver, and his work has never gone in front of this committee. the committee that reviews research to give the waivers out. So presumably Fauci just told him, or somebody at NIH just said, go ahead, forget them, don't worry about the moratorium. And he thought he had an official waiver, enough to put it in a paper. In 2017, at the beginning of the Trump administration, the moratorium was lifted, probably by Fauci and Francis Collins. And scientists were told, carte blanche, just do whatever gain of function studies you want. And no real guidelines were put into place. There have been some ideas issued, but there was no mechanism for policing it or restricting scientists. And Rand Paul has introduced a bill last year and is reintroducing it this year to create a board that would review scientific experiments to see whether the gain of function experiments should go forward. I happen to think that a board won't be sufficient, that you actually need an international effort to stop this kind of work. Unfortunately, although the WHO's pandemic treaty likes to claim that it's going to prevent pandemics, it in one of its draft, it actually said that the World Health Organization, Tedros, would choose a group of experts who would supervise gain of function research around the world. Believe it or not. And the original versions of the pandemic treaty were creating a lab network that would collect all of these potential pandemic pathogens, viruses, bacteria, fungi, other microorganisms that potentially could create deadly pandemics. And they would be kept in a WHO library and shared with pharmaceutical companies and research centers and nations, so that they could supposedly develop drugs and vaccines against them, but they could also develop, you're giving them the weapons to use as well, or develop.
That's right. That's right. They can do their own little gain of function research on the side.
Yes. So anyway, we don't know what's happening with the pandemic treaty. Something got approved yesterday by the negotiating committee called the INB, International Negotiating Body. But the media has not said what actually got approved, and the WHO has not said either. So they're kind of being very cagey about what was agreed, and I guess we'll find out at some point.
Yes.
What happened in 1972 is that a treaty called the Biological Weapons Convention was initiated. It's been signed by over 180 countries. It went into force in 1975, and it does essentially ban the research and the development of biological weapons.
Was that signed by the U.S. as well?
It was signed by the U.S. It was not signed by Israel. It contains, however, a couple of loopholes. So one of those loopholes is you're allowed to work on microorganisms for protective purposes, for defense. So obviously, you have to have some of the dangerous organism to work on the defenses against it. So you can use this as an excuse. And it says only small amounts. But that doesn't matter. When you have a virus, you can grow up huge amounts in a matter of hours or days. So you don't need a large amount. And the other loophole was that although the nations were supposed to negotiate a set of principles that would allow them to inspect countries that were suspected of developing bioweapons, those principles never got negotiated or adopted. And so there is no mechanism for inspecting to make sure that countries are complying with the treaty. And we now know that many countries have, including the US, have not, and the Russia, have not complied with the treaty. But the treaty exists, nations are signatories, and there's a group that comes together every 5 years to continue negotiating and strengthening the treaty. So I think, given the amount that is already in place, the best, quickest way to have an effective ban on gain of function is to just make a few tweaks in that treaty, get the nations to sign on to these tweaks, and then, within a year, we could have an international ban on gain of function.
Well, yes, but the problem, of course, with all these treaties is that countries are going to cheat on them, and they will, and I don't think that's ever going to be different. But I wanted to go back to the WHO. I mean, the WHO, it must love gain of function research, right? I mean, if I were the WHO, I would think, oh, this is great, because gain of function research gives us the tools to develop really, well, it's difficult, but we'll figure out how to do it, really fatal, very, very pathogenic viruses with a potentially high death rate. And that tool will give us enormous control over people. That's the one. I mean, and if you are in a global organization like the WHO, that's the kind of people that it attracts, right? That want to have power over lots of other people.
Yes.
And so makes complete sense that they would love gain of function research, and they would want it to continue. And what you said about this whole moratorium, it seems to me, okay, so under Obama it was put into place, and I'm sure there were a lot of well-meaning scientists, etc., who were in favor of that and abided by it. But but then there were other people in very powerful positions whose thinking probably went something like Fouchier and other people whose thinking went probably something like, okay, fine, let's have this moratorium. That's kind of nice window dressing. So we're not doing gain of function research, and everybody is going to be happy and won't worry about this so much anymore. And we can, in peace and quiet, just circumvent this whole thing and the stupid board that is meeting a couple of times a year, and they are probably clueless anyway. So we'll just do what we need, what we think we need to do or we want to do, and nobody will be any wiser. And so so Barack got his waiver from whomever he got it, and everything was fine.
Exactly.
Until, but it's kind of blowing up now. But so all that makes sense.
And remember, when Obama loved this whole issue of global biodefense, he really built the structures to put it in place in the United States around 2010 to 2014. But what was I going to say? When the moratorium was put in place, it was only for SARS and bird flu. You could still do gain of function on anthrax, Marburg, Ebola, smallpox. I mean, it really didn't mean very. Everybody thought it was a moratorium against gain of function in general, and that's what Obama wanted them to think. It was only for these two, and then it didn't even have any meaning for them. So again, we've been faked out, we've been lied to, and that is how, we have been governed for a long time, and we have to learn to distrust what we're told, and we have to get the evidence and find out for ourselves what's really going on.
So when this gain of function research moratorium was lifted, you said it was at the beginning of the Trump administration.
Yes.
Did he have any clue that this was happening? Was he involved in any way?
Probably not. I mean, it was lifted through NIH, which was the entity that was assigned to manage it. But of course, it's been blamed on Trump that it was lifted. But again, people think it was for everything. It was only for bird flu and SARS, and it wasn't really in effect. But these two guys, Kawaoka and Fouchier, were allowed to continue their work. So they did publish recipes for their dangerous bird flu viruses that they had developed. Fouchier even said, somebody suggested I do something really stupid, and I did. And they're still at it, and they're still being funded by the U.S. government, by the NIH. So we have to, by Fauci's NIAID. And so we have to ask, why is the federal government paying to develop, viruses that can wipe out the world? What's that
Yes,
about?
that's a very good question. And when was that? In February 2024. So that was last year. The Daily Mail ran an article saying that the US is collaborating with Chinese scientists to make bird flu strains more infectious and deadly as part of a 1 million project. And, similar to what happened with the SARS-CoV-2. And then this year, so this is, oh no, not this year. It was also last year. Congress wrote a letter to
Yes.
Tom Vilsack. So he was the USDA Secretary of U.S. Department of Agriculture, also saying what's going on. Do you know if this research still ongoing today?
I don't know. I expected that once Congress started looking at it, USDA probably stopped it, but I don't know.
Right. Okay. So we don't know that. Right. Let's see. There's so many more things to talk about, Meryl, but it's 12:30. So I wanted to ask you if you need to go, or do we have a little bit more time?
We have a little bit more time.
Okay. Then let's see, because I wanted to say a couple more things. Yes, I want to go back to what you said about the short times in which these mRNA vaccines can be developed, like the bird flu vaccine, right? You said something like, I don't know, they can do it really, really fast now, like in a month, I think you said,
No, I said 100
or
days. That was
100 days.
so arbitrarily. This group, CEPI, a coalition for epidemic preparedness innovation. Innovation means getting rid of regulation, because that's the only way you can do this. So they wanted to do it in 100 days, but now they'd like to, even 100 days is not fast enough, because a virus can spread through a population very fast. Look at how fast not bird flu, but SARS-CoV-2 went through COVID. And that's why they locked us down. They locked us down. Well, they said they locked us down till they could get a vaccine, which took a year. But they also locked us down to try to reduce the spread, to prolong the pandemic. Because if we hadn't been locked down, it probably would have gone through in 2 or 3 months, and that would have been the end of it. And by 100 days, you wouldn't have needed a vaccine anymore. Everyone would be immune or dead. So what CEPI really wants to do is get a vaccine even quicker than 100 days, but they're hamstrung by law, by existing regulations. So what they're trying to do is to create new mechanisms by which they can change the laws. One of those is to harmonize the requirements for vaccines, so worldwide, or at least in the global south, so that WHO now has had for a while the ability to, quote, pre-qualify vaccines, which means most countries don't have their own FDA. So WHO can decide whether a vaccine, say made in India, the Serum Institute of India is the biggest vaccine manufacturer in the world. So they can decide whether a vaccine made by India's Serum Institute is good enough to be used in the rest of the global south, and they will pre-qualify it. And so, by the way, Bill Gates' employees have been free consultants to the WHO to help do that. So this is a way to get private industry becoming regulators. Another way is to harmonize. What they use this term harmonize, which means make the regulations identical around the world. And so basically you lower the regulatory requirements as low as you can, and then make everybody use those requirements. So CEPI and this horrible man, Jeremy Farrar, is working on that, trying to push through that everyone's going to use the same regulatory process, and that it will be, very much abbreviated from what we have now. And what we have now is clearly not good enough, because we've poisoned ourselves with the COVID vaccines, but they want it much reduced. And then with the so they're leaving themselves open to several mechanisms. They can use the mock-up vaccine and potentially, get a vaccine approved. They got the one of the pandemic flu vaccines approved using a mock-up method in 5 days by the EMA, the European Medicines Association, which is the FDA of the European Union. 5 days to
5 days.
approve that pandemic vaccine, and then it caused narcolepsy.
Was that so? That wasn't tested at all, then, I would think.
Well, not enough. Not enough. I mean, you have to wait. The serious side effects of vaccines usually don't happen on the first day. They usually take weeks or even months, and then they happen. With the COVID vaccines, the myocarditis did happen in the first few days, but the heart attacks and the strokes happen months later. So,
yes,
right. If you license it in 5 days, you're going to miss most of the side effects. So that's one method, and the other method is harmonizing, and the other method is trying to convince regulatory agencies or the WHO. And of course, Jeremy Farrar is now the chief scientist at the WHO, so he'll be controlling how the WHO pre-qualifies vaccines. And so they have a plan to roll. Now, why do they want vaccines? We already have lots of drugs. When you get sick, you take a drug, right? I mean, a vaccine takes time. Once you're vaccinated, if you get one dose of a vaccine, it takes at least 2 weeks for you to be immunized. If you need 2 doses of a vaccine, it usually takes about 6 weeks for you to be immunized. It's not quick enough for a virus that's rushing through a population like COVID did. So what they really should be working on is drugs. But what they did during COVID was to suppress the drugs that worked, like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, took away my license because I was telling people to use these drugs and to avoid this dangerous vaccine. They took away the licenses of some other doctors. They made many doctors' lives miserable. Many people lost their jobs if they didn't go with the program. And that's what they want to do again. Why vaccines instead of drugs? Well, they can charge more, I think, for vaccines, but I'm not sure that's the reason. I think they want the opportunity to stick needles in us and inject us with things that they are in control of. And if they make a vaccine, in 100 days or 30 days, and it turns out it kills a percentage of the population, they'll say, well, hey, we only had 30 days, we only had 100 days. We didn't have enough time. We were working under pressure. We were dealing with a deadly virus. We did the best we could. And there aren't that many drugs that kill you. And if they do kill you, they often kill you very fast. Not always. But with vaccines, it usually takes a while to kill you, so they can roll the vaccine out to the entire population before people realize that the vaccine is killing you, which is exactly what happened with COVID vaccines.
Right.
So, I mean, it's an important question. Why
yes.
are they so focused on vaccines, and why are they doing everything they can to fight against effective drugs? If they really wanted to save us, they would be looking at both options and be desperately, trying to advance the useful drugs. Hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin work for other viruses besides COVID. They should be studied for all these viruses, but no, they want the vaccine solution. And so we have to be very suspicious of why that is, because it's clearly not for our benefit.
Absolutely. And just to put that into context, when you step back, when people step back in 100 years or so, if we're still around, and look at what happened, you would think that what you just said to me, that they are so fixated on vaccines and mRNA vaccines, right? You would think, well, that is completely impossible after what happened with the COVID mRNA vaccines, because they inflicted so much harm, so much death, so carnage on the American people, and everybody knows it. Because just from asking around, everybody I know knows people who have either been terribly damaged, badly damaged, not just a little bit, or know people who have died. But I don't know people who have died of COVID. I personally don't know a single person who has died of COVID. Well, maybe they died because they were forced to get on the ventilator and get remdesivir, but they didn't die of COVID. So this fact alone, so you have this, people know that, Americans know that. That's a well-known, it's not reflected in the media and not even in the administration, because RFK hasn't been talking about it yet, I hope. But there's this big silence and this big knowledge in the population. And the whole thing is just really weird and really dystopian, because you would think, oh, Meryl doesn't have to talk, that people will shy away from vaccines. We had this horrible disaster with the mRNA vaccines, and it was the wrong thing to do, and it was terrible, and we learned our lesson. But no, it's not like that at all. It's like we are going to continue on this path. We are pretending that nothing bad ever happened, and we'll just continue with dozens of mRNA pipelines. We continue with the entire approach, and not only that, we make it even worse with self-amplifying mRNA vaccines, or vaccines that are sprayed through the air, so that we don't have that pesky problem with people who don't want to get a vaccine. Which you bet, if you wanted to who's going to get all these vaccines? You have to strap people down from now on to get these mRNA shots into them. Do you think anybody would want to get these vaccines again, or some similar product?
I thought nobody would, but so at the ACIP meeting yesterday, I listened to part of it. They were claiming that 10 to 20% of the population is still getting COVID vaccines, and this was the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices at CDC. They want to roll out a COVID shot for this fall.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. So 10 to 20%, well, that is way less. That is still way too many, but it's not many.
Yeah, I'm not sure I believe those numbers.
Yeah, maybe it's not even true.
We can't believe they've played with a lot of numbers in the past, but they claim that 81% got one shot, and that 69% got two shots. So there were 12% of the population who didn't like it after the first shot and decided not to get any more. And then there were only 34% who got three shots. So there's this small tail that still believes and still thinks they need to be protected against COVID.
Yes, but it's a minority. So most people don't want to have anything to do with these shots. So for whom are these shots? The vast majority of Americans are not going to take them. And I think it's going to be a very different situation in the future. Are these people not aware of it?
The problem is that people get their information from the media. And until the Trump administration gets control of the media and makes sure that they don't spread in unison false narratives, people can be convinced that they're faced with another deadly disease, and they will do what they're told. Many of them will do what they're told, maybe half.
Maybe half. Well, so I guess we'll see. There were these strange warnings recently, right? Was Fouchier in an interview said some strange things about future threats?
Yeah,
Can you go into that?
Pandemic. But he said that when Trump came in the first time, for sure there will be something. I mean, this is their business. Their business model is to scare the public so that governments will allot many billions of dollars to work on drugs and vaccines and whatever else, testing methods, etc. Will keep their people, in cushy jobs. Under Biden, in 2023, I believe, $20 billion were allotted to CDC alone for biodefense. And there was more money for Homeland Security and more money for DOD. So you're looking at, massive amounts of money going into this. If the WHO original idea for its pandemic treaty and its whole pandemic surveillance system had been accepted, I don't think it will be, that would have cost 100 to 200 billion to set up according to McKinsey, and then about 40 billion a year to maintain. Who's going to pay that money now that Trump's in and saying we're not going along with that? Where is this money going to come from?
They won't get it.
Is Ursula going to just, take the bank accounts of the European citizens and say we're investing it in saving your life from pandemics?
No, not going to happen. They just don't have any way of getting that money together, I think. But how about, because this whole question of WHO and what they are up to and the pandemic treaty, you're extremely well informed about all these things. And also now that the United States is leaving the treaty or is in the process of withdrawing, I don't really know, but Trump is getting the United States out. And what does that actually mean? Are we still somehow beholden to some of what, I don't know what that legally means. I've read various things about it. So actually, if you're up to it, I would love to do another interview with you sometime to talk about this.
Sure.
Because that's a whole other can of worms.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Okay.
And it's better not to do it today because they just vote, this committee just voted on something last night, which they won't tell us what it is. And we're going to have to see how it plays out. Probably the middle of May, before the next meeting of the World Health Assembly, when they will actually vote on a pandemic treaty. Shortly before that, we'll have a better idea of what's going on.
Okay, let's do that. And I wanted to make one last point that I had originally wanted to say that earlier, but somehow didn't. The whole question of testing the chickens for bird flu. I mean, I find that all very dubious because I heard that they're doing the PCR test. And we all know the PCR test, and we all know by now that it was never meant as a test. It wasn't developed as a test. It's really not a test, but it's used as a test. And if you cycle, depending on the number of cycles that you do in this test, you can. So I read that for the bird flu, if you do up to 30 cycles, so 30 cycles, that's fine. That gives you a valid result. But I read that for testing for bird flu, they are increasing the cycles to 45 cycles. So at 45 cycles, you can find it everywhere. So everybody has bird flu. It's everywhere. It's a meaningless result. So that raises the question in my mind, do we even know how many of these supposedly sick chickens actually are sick, unless you can really tell they are sick because they're not doing well. But for the others, we get this result, oh, they are sick with bird flu. Are they really sick? Do we really know?
The federal agencies do not want anyone looking over their shoulder and grading their homework. So they have tests, but they don't tell you exactly what tests they're using. Early on in the pandemic, they said they were checking every positive animal at one of the USDA's 2 reference labs in the United States. And so I think they were confirming the PCR results, and that every human positive test is being confirmed at the CDC. But we don't know what tests they're using for confirmation, and we don't know what PCR tests they're using initially. Those cycle thresholds are ridiculous. I don't think we should throw out the PCR test with the bathwater. I think it's a very useful test for screening, as long as you know what you're doing. You have to know how well your probes and primers work and how many cycle thresholds and what other microorganisms might be contaminating or might have identical structures, or maybe something has the same structure backwards, and you're only looking at about 20 nucleotide stretch of nucleotides, which is not very many. Each one can be one of 4 things. So you're looking at 4 to the 20th divided by 2. It's not impossible that you could have picked a sequence that is duplicated by other microorganisms, and those are what you're finding. So if you understand what you're doing and you're a very clever scientist like Dr. Sinang Lee, good. Use the PCR test and you'll get the right result because you'll confirm that everything you're doing is correct and you'll know what you're working with. But the vast majority of people who are doing these tests, they get a cassette. They get a commercial piece of property, they put it in a machine, they put their sample in, and and the machine spits out a number and they believe it. And there are so many things that can affect that number, and they're not aware of what those things are. Even what the quality. So you need these expensive enzymes to make it work. Well, I was talking to Dr. Lee. It turns out that you can buy them from different companies, and the cheaper ones are not as good as the more expensive ones. So you're going to get a different answer depending on which enzyme you buy. And people are not accounting for this. Anyway, so using the PCR as a screening test is, in my view, okay, as long as you use a more definitive test before you claim you have a diagnosis of either an animal or a human. And unfortunately, we don't know whether that's we don't know what the agencies are doing. And given their degree of secrecy, I can only assume that they don't feel confident in what they're doing. If they felt confident of their tests, they would let us repeat the tests. They would let us examine what they're doing, but they don't. So
yes, and not only that, Meryl, I think they wouldn't only let us, they would want us to. They would say, come, look, I'm going to explain to you exactly what I'm doing because you should know, and this is what we are doing, and this is how it works, and you can check it, and we want you to and maybe we made a mistake, and then please tell us. That's the way it should be. But the way you're explaining it, there are these agencies, and they don't want us to look over their shoulders. You kind of feel like you are in a big flock of anonymous chickens yourself. These dumb chickens will do. They have no right to know what the powerful overlords are doing to them. That's the way you feel, and that is that's a very scary thought. Okay, well, thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to our next interview.
Great, me too. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Cornelia.
Thank you.